May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. One of my colleagues, Quinn Caldwell, begins his Christmas Eve service by saying, "If you came to this place expecting a tame story, you came to the wrong place. If you came to hear of the coming of a God who showed up only so that you could have a nice day with your loved ones, then you came for a God that we do not worship here." Sadly, many people are satisfied with a snow globe faith, everything perfect and beautiful. But they are missing the true depth of our faith, the reassurance of a love which upholds us during dangerous times. They fail to understand a faith which holds us firm, not just in the good, but also in the struggle and in the downright bad. The reality is that life is difficult, messy, and challenging much of the time. And if we want to have a faith that can meet us in those spaces, then it too needs to be difficult and messy and challenging. Author Annie Dillard tells us that when we come to worship, we should all wear crash helmets, lash ourselves to the pews, and have life preservers and signal flares at the ready. Our faith and our faith stories are not meant to be fairy tales. They're not even meant to necessarily make us feel better. They are meant to make us think, to challenge our assumptions, and try to make us see the world from other people's perspectives. Although our faith should comfort us when we are hurting or struggling, it also should afflict us when we are too comfortable. Our faith is meant to stir us, to test us, to challenge us, and most importantly, to stretch us. It is meant to make us question our assumptions, to struggle with our tightly held, ingrained perceptions, and to begin to challenge what we believe to be true. And this is never more so than in the stories of the women that have been highlighted in Jesus's genealogy, according to Matthew. The addition of these women in the family tree is not a claim to some royal heritage. It is not to gain advantage or to assume some pedigree. Instead, it seems that these stories of these women is meant to provoke us and to make us reconsider rules and laws in the face of real life. We are told in the Bible that Israelites should not marry with people from other faiths and other lands. And yet, we have the stories of these women in Jesus's lineage coming from other clans. We are warned about sexual immorality repeatedly in our scriptures. And yet, these stories push at our very definitions of immorality. And unfortunately, in many of the stories of the Bible, women are often ignored, looked past, or even left unnamed. And in some scriptures, they are told to be quiet and even subservient. But in these stories, these women are brazen and bold and clearly take charge of the situation. They push the limits and refuse to accept things the way they are. Every time it seems that we think we understand where the circle of in and out is, our good book tests those limits. Matthew, by naming these particular women, highlights some of the most unexpected and unusual stories of the Bible. So stories that even in today's life, many families might tell them in hushed tones or with words of, "Don't tell anyone, I told you, but did you know?" preceding them. Mary, Bathsheba, Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar certainly remind us not to judge anyone and to be open to how God may be working even in the worst of times. One of the interesting commonalities of these women is the way they assert themselves in the stories. While they are all in very precarious positions, none of them let the precarious positions overwhelm or overtake them. This is especially true of our two women today, Rahab and Tamar. Rahab, as we heard, lives in a home that is built in the wall of the city of Jericho. Some say that she was a madam or a prostitute, while others translate her profession as innkeeper. Either way, the location of her home and her vocation place her in the literal margins and apparently put her in contact with the Israelite spies who have come to do reconnaissance on the city that they are about to overtake. In our story, Rahab is forced to make a choice between being faithful to the people and city in which she lives or being faithful to God and supporting the insurgents. After hiding the spies on her roof among the flax, she, like Ruth, makes a beautiful and moving affirmation of faith, claiming the God of the Israelites as the true God, the God of heaven and earth. And then, with the threat of being found, she bargains with the spies for the safety of her and her family and trades their lives today for her and her family's lives tomorrow. Likewise, but in a completely different format, Tamar also ensures the continuation of her family line. She begins in a typical way we hear of women in the Bible. She is promised off to marriage. But the story says that her husband, was wicked, and God killed him. And thus, because of levirate marriage, she is then married off to Er's brother, Onan, who agrees to the marriage but refuses to do his husbandly duties. Perhaps, they say, because he doesn't want to share his family's inheritance with what would be considered his brother's son. Thus, God again, the story says, kills him. And this leaves Tamar with no husband and no son. But alas, as we heard, there's one more son, Shelah, who can redeem them all. But Shelah is young. And for obvious reasons, Shelah's father is a little nervous about marrying off his third son to this woman. Thus, Judah puts off Tamar and puts her off some more, and then even a little more, until it becomes clear to Tamar that this promise is not going to get fulfilled. And so she takes the situation into her own hands to ensure that a child will be born. She hides her identity, tricks her father-in-law Judah into a physical relationship so that his obligation can be fulfilled and her future secured. These are tough stories. They shock us. They are stories that we would like to skip over and maybe just forget. Part of this, I think, is because the redeeming qualities seem to be trickery, manipulation, deception, and deceit, and frankly, even a little blackmail. And these are not qualities that we typically associate with God or with our faith. And yet, the author of Matthew is drawing our attention to them, which leads me to understand and wonder why. Why are these women honored? Why are these questionable relationships even recorded, let alone lifted up? I think to begin to reckon with that, we have to let go of our privilege. We have to release the mindset of people who are, for the most part, secure. We have to imagine ourselves in a situation where our very existence is threatened, and the existence of our family and our future is bleak. It is in and from this more tenuous place that we begin to see the virtue of these stories. Theologian Susan Niditch says in the Women's Bible Commentary, one of the biblical author's favorite narrative patterns is that of the trickster. Well, we think of a trickster as someone doing something devious and perhaps underhanded. Niditch explains that the Israelites would not have heard it that way. She says Israelites portray their ancestors and thereby imagine themselves as the underdogs, as people outside of the establishment who achieve success in a roundabout and irregular ways. And one of the ways that people on the margins confront power and achieve their goals is through deception and trickery. In other words, they perceive this deception and trickery as the only way for the rigged playing field to be made even. As a reality TV show Survivor says, the goal is to outwit, outlast, and outplay. And indeed, that is what these women do. Rahab did this to the king of Jericho by telling him half-truths and sending the guards on a wild goose chase. To the Israelite soldiers by hiding them out in the open and exacting a promise of safe passage before she got them to safety, and by being ready to move with her whole family when the time came. Tamar did this through patiently waiting and trusting until it became clear that she couldn't wait any longer, but had to take the next steps in her own hands. She did this through daring to put herself in a dangerous position where she might be recognized by her father-in-law. And she did this through her astute understanding of people, knowing that her father-in-law was not so much a good man and was not worth his word, and therefore would have to be threatened to follow through. No CBS Survivor season was ever as exciting as this. These stories aren't of love, kindness, and peace, and all the other good things that we like to associate with our faith. Instead, they are about strength, survival, and a hope that is predicated on the willingness to enact it. When you are at the bottom of the barrel, bruised and pressed, one cannot sustain oneself through hope alone. Hope instead becomes courage in action. These stories speak to the people on the margins who are relentlessly placed in dangerous positions, many outside of their control. And they speak to people who understand desperation, frustration, and who face the unfairness of life. These stories resonate with those who have fought for their own survival, often having to resort to methods that in times of peace and comfort seem untenable. These stories speak to and inform us about Jesus's care for those on the margin and remind us of God's preference for the poor and disenfranchised. To be honest, these stories remind me of the stories that I have heard about the Holocaust and about slavery and about migration and other stories of oppressed and marginalized people, stories of people who had to take their survival into their own hands because no one else was looking out for them. The story of people who scrapped and scraped by and who put their own lives on the line, who took risks that could have meant, and for many of them did mean, death. The story of people who sometimes had to break the written rules to live by more true and more faithful and more equitable rules. They remind me of all the people who feel like hope is lost, and yet they persist and push on and trust that when it feels like the world is not on their side, that God is the one on their side. Matthew is not highlighting the easy parts of the story when he chooses to name Mary, Bathsheba, Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar. He instead is drawing our attention to some of the most difficult stories, but also those stories that without Christianity would not exist because Jesus would have never come to be. The author reminds us that God is always working, even when we may think that we have been abandoned. He also seeks to give us deeper insight on humanity and forces us to face that sometimes behind all those positive values of goodness, kindness, and love must come the hard values of persistence, courage, justice, and sometimes even the disruption of the status quo. As we move closer to Christmas, I want to encourage you to hold on to these women's stories, as uncomfortable as they are. I encourage you to revisit them and to continue to struggle with them, because it is in them that the meaning of Christmas is embedded. Christmas is not the pristine picture that we paint it. It is built on faith, but on fear, on courage and on hope, but also on struggle, on perseverance, on grit, on our ability to care for one another and the strength of those who came before us. Remember, our faith is born in a stable, not in a palace. Our faith is born in the shape of a child, not a king. Our faith is born in a little town of Bethlehem, not in the center of the empire. Our faith is not a snow globe faith that many wish it to be. It is not a faith built on easy stories. Instead, it is complicated and fraught with hard tales. But don't look away. For it is usually here that we most see ourselves. It is usually here in the suffering that we begin to open up ourselves to God. It is usually here where miracles happen. This is the good news. God is with us, even when we least expect it. Amen.